In this course, we're going to build an app that shows you the top 3 reviews for restaurants around you using the Yelp API. We're going to cover a lot of ground here and build on top of everything we know so far. If you're jumping right into this course, you might want to take a look at the recommended prerequisites. Unlike any of the APIs we've used before, to use the Yelp API, we need to authorize ourselves to the Yelp server. So a big topic we'll be tackling in this course is how to use the OAuth protocol to achieve this. We've learned about networking and operations to a certain degree, but we're going to augment that knowledge in many ways. First, we'll look at how we can use protocols and generics in Swift to reduce boilerplate in our networking code and make it more flexible. Second, we'll talk about the various ways in which we can use operations, and we'll touch on things like operation dependencies. Now, of course, part of finding restaurants around you means allowing an app to query your location. So we're going to take a stab at location-based APIs as well as displaying results on a map. I should note that in the past 2 courses, when we wrote networking code, we spent a good bit of time going through API documentation, how to read it, and how to use tools like Postman to understand how an API works. For this course, I'm going to assume that you know how to do that. And I trust that if you have any questions about how the Yelp API works, you'll check their documentation. There's 2 versions of their API, and we're going to be using the new one called Yelp Fusion. As we talk about parts of the API that we'll be using, I will include links to the relevant documentation sections in the teacher's notes so that you can read up. Now, in order to achieve many of our tasks here, we can't write code from scratch. That would take weeks. So instead, we're going to be using, for the first time, code that other people have written, tested, and are distributing online. Code that is often known as a third-party library. There will be plenty of new stuff here, so I've taken the liberty of doing a lot of the work for you to get the app up and running. Head over to the Teacher's Notes section of this video and download the starter files link there. Now, once you have it, open it up, and let's walk through it together. Don't be intimidated if there's a decent number of files and lines of code in here. There's actually very little going on. So at the top of the project directory, you'll see 3 groups or folders: permissions, search, and business details. These are the 3 main sections of the app we're building. Rather than put all the controllers in one group, all the view models in another, and so on, I've organized them by functionality so that you can easily get to them. There are 2 groups below this, models and networking. The code in here is used by nearly every view controller and view, so they are in their own groups. At the very top, in permissions, the permissions controller is where we'll start our work. We need to get 2 sets of permissions to make this app work. First, we need to authorize against the Yelp API, and then we need permission from the user to track their location. All of that logic will live in this permissions controller. Now, all the code in here is simply UI code. So rather than set this view up in Interface Builder, I've created 3 buttons. So we have the location permissions button, the OAuth token button, and the dismiss button. And I've laid them all out in code. And that's mostly because I'm doing some ornamental stuff, and like giving it a border radius, as you can see right here, and different styles based on whether we have permissions or not. All of that is easier in code rather than in Interface Builder. The way it's set up right now, when the app starts, the entry point is the Yelp search controller. That's our main screen. So that is under the search group. If, however, the user does not have both sets of permissions, then we'll automatically present the permissions controller modally and handle that aspect. If you go to the Yelp search controller, you'll see that in View Did Appear, I'm checking to see if we're authorized, and if not, then I call the check permissions method. Now, the rest of the view controller in here is just some bare bones setup. We're going to use a search bar in a search controller, and then a table view to display the search results. However, we're not using a table view controller like we do usually. Instead, if you go up to the top, you'll see that this is a plain old view controller, and we have a table view as an outlet, so as a stored property. This table view is added as an instance as a sub-view to the view controller's main view. Now, this is because I want to add a map view at the top above our table view, but I don't want to put it in the table view's header view because I don't want the map to disappear when we scroll down the list. So if you go to main.storyboard, you can see how this is laid out. So here's that screen, the Yelp search controller. So we have the table view at the bottom, and then there's going to be a map up here. Notice for now that there's no map here. We'll fix that later. The next main view controller is the Yelp Business Detail controller that displays some information about the restaurant as well as the top 3 reviews. Now, the choice of 3 reviews isn't arbitrary. The Yelp API only returns 3 results when you query the reviews endpoint for a particular business. Both view controllers, the search and the detail, use the usual series of helper objects to set itself up. So in each group, you'll see that there's a data source and so on. In the business details, there's also a view model, a custom cell object, and nothing you're not familiar with. Now, if you head over back to the storyboard file and look at the details scene, you'll notice something potentially interesting here. I've used a combination. So if you click into this header view section here, you'll notice in the outline that I've used a combination of a vertical and horizontal stack views to easily lay this view out. Now, in addition, there's another placeholder view here, this empty thing right under the restaurant name. We're going to replace this with a star rating view, but we'll get to that. That brings us to the models group, and this is pretty self-explanatory. This contains all the models I've defined to encapsulate all the data returned by the Yelp API. Now, I've taken it one step further, and I've defined a protocol called JSON Decodable, which is in the networking group. So all conforming types must implement a failable initializer that instantiates an instance of that type using JSON data. And you'll notice that this protocol has a bunch of comments, and these are in a particular format. So these are Xcode comments that I've put in for any code that might need additional explanation. So if you're going through this starter file set and you're like, I don't know what this method does, because this is an Xcode comment, that means that if you option click on the method, you'll get, well, if Xcode works, so let me build and see if this works. So if I option click on init, you'll see that I get a description of the method. So basically it's pulling this information from the comment and including it in that tooltip that pops up. Nearly all the models I've defined conform to JSON Decodable. So if you go to Yelp Business, for example, you'll see here that it conforms to JSON Decodable and we have the initializer. This means that you don't have to do any additional work to allow this object to be initialized with incoming JSON data. All that is done. So once you get the data, it's just a matter of using the right initializer. I encourage you to explore these models to understand the types of data that we'll get back and how I've defined it. Finally, I've already modeled the Yelp API using a type that conforms to a protocol we've defined called endpoint. And again, this is one that you should be familiar with. If you're not, don't worry, there's documentation, so you can simply option click. Now, using this enum, we can easily create the URLs we need to get the relevant data. So down at the bottom, you'll see this endpoint defined for Yelp. Poke around, see if anything is new to you. It shouldn't be. But if it is, again, there are documentation comments here and there to explain what's going on. Okay, so now we have a good place to build upon. In the next video, let's talk about authorization.